Now, with me, as you may have seen already, is Patrick CREHAN again. Good morning, Patrick. For those who joined only after the break, Patrick is the innovation lead at INNOVEAS and has been exploring a different perspective on this entire discussion. And Patrick, you have some thoughts to share on a manifesto, right?
Yeah. So just coming back to the whole idea of this web event, the idea that we need to go beyond business as usual if Europe is to achieve its goal of net zero in 2050. And when we refer to business as usual, we're talking about the practice based on the European Energy Efficiency Directive, where large companies are required to carry out an audit at least every 4 years. And there was thinking within the project that, to bring SMEs on board, this approach could be extended to SMEs in some way. Well, it turns out that this practice is not well adapted to the needs of SMEs. The amount of energy, the amount they spend on energy directly tends to be very, very small. And it doesn't provide a lot of motivation. But thankfully, we've seen that there are many other benefits to be had from a range of measures, not so much based on energy, but more based on the logic of carbon, and perhaps also on other logics, such as a logic of preserving biodiversity. So this is the first thing that we saw. And our conclusion, the conclusion of many of the institutions who are involved in this debate, the International Energy Agency, the European Clusters Association, EREC, the European Resource Efficiency Knowledge Hub, and other actors. Their conclusion is that we need to change systemically and at scale and do much more than we've done before, and to do it quicker if we are to reach this goal of net zero in 2050. And this is why I introduced the term massive change. It's a term I came across from reading Bruce Mau, who is a Canadian designer and architect. And the idea of massive change is that it is change that is both systemic and on a huge and unprecedented scale. And this is precisely the type of change that is required in dealing with SMEs. Now, when we talk about SMEs, there's a tendency to treat it as a homogeneous group. But the reality is that SMEs are as varied as humanity itself. And one of the things that we'll need to do moving forward is to understand that the population of SMEs in Europe, they break down into different kinds, not by sector, but really in terms of attitude towards the future and their ability to adopt new ways of working. Now, I've put up on the screen this bell curve, which some of you may already be familiar with. It's often called the technology adoption curve. It's called the corn curve. It's used in marketing also to model the adoption of new products. And it's also used in the study of SMEs and startups in the way that they're able to move from a few early customers and develop product and services for an increasingly important market. It goes back about 100 years, and its origin is in observing the behavior of farmers planting corn and their ability to adopt new varieties of corn. And what sociologists observed at the time is that you'll have a very small population of farmers that are quick to try out something new. And then you have other identifiable groups that follow on. And in the case of the planting of corn, it was roughly an 8-year cycle where you would start from the crazy guys that would try almost anything, to what we call the laggards. These are the guys who are the last to adopt something that has shown obvious benefits. Now, the point of the most recent reinvention or rediscovery of this idea was probably by Geoffrey Moore in Silicon Valley. And he wrote a book about 10 or maybe 15 years ago called Crossing the Chasm. And this is the gap. You see, you have two segments, two green segments in the beginning, and then you have a break. And this is the chasm that he's talking about. And he's referring to the phenomenon that was well known to venture capitalists and people operating with startups in Silicon Valley, that a startup often has a few early customers, people willing to, or organizations willing to try out their product and service. And then after the first few, once it's demonstrated, they might get a few more, etc. But these early adopters are really just a trickle. And then you reach a barrier. And the whole point about this, that what Geoffrey Moore wanted to explain, is that your first customers, the early adopters, are really quite special in many ways. And then the ones that make up your typical consumer after that, or your typical buyer of the product, do so for very different reasons from the first ones. And so the point about it is that you can segment the population in this way, and depending on these segments, the way that you approach them, the reasons why they adopt are quite different. And in growing your business, or in growing the adoption of whether it's a new product or a new concept, you need to be aware of which segment you're in, and you need to adapt your language accordingly, because the arguments that you need to provide to provoke adoption are going to vary as you pass from one segment to another. So one of the things that I've done is just really to provoke discussion on this issue is I've segmented the population of SMEs in the same way as Geoffrey Moore and many others before him have done. The first ones are what you call the enthusiasts or the innovators. They do stuff because it's new and they're willing to try anything to see if it works. And if we translate the population of SMEs in Europe, which is roughly 22.8 million small enterprises, this early adoption population corresponds to about 750,000 entities across Europe. And I would say that, you know, many of the SMEs that approach organizations like CO2 Logic, which was represented by Mathieu Crébellier, many of those who spontaneously pick up the phone and approach CO2 Logic do so because they see an opportunity to innovate or to differentiate themselves from the competition. And then you'll have others that follow on. These are not the visionaries, but they're the more like the mainstream innovators. And they might do so for competitive reasons. They see that their competitors are doing this. They see that they're doing well by this, and they want to follow quickly so that they don't lose out in terms of market share. Now, don't be confused. You know, the language of this adoption curve was initially constructed, or has been constructed, to refer to the adoption of products to be bought in the marketplace. And you can look at this either from a consumer's perspective or from a salesperson perspective. But exactly the same dynamic works for the adoption of new practices and new ideas. Marketing in modern parlance is just changing behaviors. It's the science of changing behavior. So the point about it is that we have, I think we have seen this morning through the different sessions and the different speakers that there are very many reasons to adopt measures such as energy efficiency measures, to switch to renewables, to work in terms of carbon sequestration, etc. There are very many reasons to do this, and the populations of SMEs will break down into those that are motivated in different ways. Some by a need to innovate, some by the fear of competition, and others by the big stick of their client telling them that one day they could be deselected from the supply chain if they don't get in line and demonstrate their adhesion to the principle of going green, going net zero by 2050.